Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on optimizing communications between development and finance. My name is John Eusanio. I'm a partner and practice leader here at Citrin Cooperman's not-for-profit industry sector, and I'm thrilled to have all of you with us today. In today's fast-paced environment and economy, effective communications between departments is crucial now more than ever. When it comes to relationships between development and finance, the stakes are even higher generally. Development teams are often tasked with creating innovative solutions and practical solutions that help to drive nonprofit organizations' growth and success, where on the other hand, the finance department plays a vital role in helping to manage budgets, allocating resources, and ensuring financial sustainability for our organizations. However, oftentimes there's a lot of miscommunications, misunderstandings, and sometimes a lack of alignment between the two departments that can cause inefficiencies and delays and unfortunately missed opportunities for the organizations. That's why it's essential that we bridge the gap and hopefully optimize communications between our development teams and our finance for the entire organization. Today, we've gathered two experts who will share their insights and strategies and best practices on how we can improve this collaboration and help to streamline the processes between the departments. So whether you're a developmental officer, whether you're a finance professional, or just a leader that's looking to enhance your webinar, enhance your organization's communications, this webinar should be geared towards helping you implement some ideas immediately. Next slide, please. So some housekeeping reminders here on using Zoom. This webinar is scheduled to be 1 hour, and we do encourage your participation, active participation. There is a Q&A function within the webinar for you to submit questions as they arise. We will do our best to respond to them in a timely fashion, leaving some Q&A response times at the end of each segment that we are within. Again, you are in listen-only mode at this portion of time, so do utilize that Q&A function. The session is being recorded and will be available for playback with links being sent to each of the attendees afterwards. Next slide, please. So I want to take a few moments here just to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Patti Collins. She's a renowned fundraising consultant with over 30 years of experience in both corporate and nonprofit sectors. Patti has done a lot of work when it comes to fundraising and business development and strategic planning and volunteer management. She has dedicated her career to independent schools and nonprofit organizations to achieve their financial goals. So again, we're more than delighted and happy to have her with us today. Our second speaker, Brian Giganti, is a partner in our Citrin Cooperman's Bethesda office. He brings a wealth of knowledge working in audit, tax, and advisory services with his clients, often including those with charitable entities, foundations, educational and medical organizations, and trade associations. So with that, let's jump into our agenda on the next slide, which highlights the 5 sectors that we're going to identify today. Creating an effective gift policy, understanding the different types of campaigns and how to utilize it, contributions in general, along with internal reporting and accounting, and third-party fundraising consultants and how to best utilize them. So with that, let's turn it over to our panelists and start our next section on creating effective gift policies.
So the graphic on this page has particular significance to today's presentation. One underlying theme of our presentation today is that the need for development and accounting to understand each other's responsibilities and needs for information, and that both departments work together as all parties in the organization's chances of success would increase. What better way to express this theme visually than through a picture of a rowing team working together to achieve success. Now, there's a secret message or Easter egg in this picture, and that is Patti's daughter, Claire, is a member of the USA Women's 8 rowing team that will be competing in Paris in a few weeks. So, that's something that's a wonderful thing for us, for the country, for Patti. And so I think we just give her a little bit of recognition on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go Team USA.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Brian, and John. This is really wonderful to be here and to be able to talk about this topic, which I know is near and dear to our heart, Brian. And we know that there are often these discrepancies and misunderstandings between the two offices. I often like to say it's a little bit like one speaks Greek and one speaks Latin, but it is possible to have a translation and to better understand each other's language. And I think today we hope to give you some of those tidbits so that you can put them to use in your organization right away. Next slide, please. So one of the most effective tools that we can implement in our organizations is a gift acceptance policy. And you might ask, well, why should we have one of those? Some of you may have them already, but I would like to talk about the importance of them in this role of communications. First of all, it's a very effective tool to define the role of philanthropic support for the institution and your organization, and to acknowledge the importance of it to all stakeholders, to the board, to your head of the institution, to the finance department, the development department, and to donors. It really should align with your mission and your strategic goals and priorities. These policies, I just want to underscore, can be evergreen and should be a standard policy. We'll talk a little bit coming up about special campaigns and where you might want to modify them, but all in all, we really recommend that you have this policy in place on an ongoing, regular, day-to-day basis. The policy is usually approved by your board once it is drawn up and the communications has taken place between all the stakeholders internally to define the policy. And we'll talk a little bit about those key components in a minute. One of the things that's really important about this is that it gives guidance to what type of gifts are accepted and what you're looking for to support the mission of your organization. And therefore, how are they solicited and how are they managed? That's pretty obvious. I will share with you something that may not be totally obvious, which is it also should define what type of gifts aren't accepted. So just remember, every gift that's offered to an organization does not have to be accepted. So what examples could I give you that might illustrate that? Well, you might not want something that's very illiquid. You might not want a gift that conflicts with the mission, the interest, or maybe could harm the reputation of your institution. Also, gifts might come with an additional cost to administer or maintain. So you want to think through all of those types of situations when you are offered what I'm going to call a very special gift. The gift acceptance policy also allows you to have a way to resolve gifts that don't fall into really one or the other of these types of situations. So setting up a committee in advance under this gift acceptance policy allows you to know how to deal with a gift when it's presented and it needs to be discussed and maybe approved at a board level. Usually on that committee, you'll have the head of development. They're the ones trying to, of course, make this happen, move it forward with some urgency with the donor. They might chair that. You might have a board representative from the board development committee on that as well, the head of your institution and the head of finance. And when you have that opportunity to know that everybody's on that committee and have that discussion, you can then make a recommendation to the organization about what you would like to do with a special gift. The other really important thing about the communications and oversight here that we're talking about by having a gift acceptance policy in place is that it really immediately operationalizes your development office. They can go forward, they can solicit gifts, they know their guidelines. So it provides a nice check and balance for a development office, maybe an overzealous even development office that wants to take in any and all gifts. So it's really at the bottom line is it is a guide for the organization to really know what types of gifts you're going to accept and what types of gifts you won't, and how to convene a committee to discuss anything that falls in between. So I want to just stop there for a minute. I don't know if we have any questions before we move on. No?
None at this time.
Okay, great. So let's talk about, next slide, please. We just want to talk about the key components of a gift acceptance policy. So first, we would think about what types of gifts are accepted. I mentioned a minute ago, illiquid gifts. Really, the best that you would want to have for your organization would be liquid gifts, cash, check, credit cards, and unrestricted gifts. These allow you to put to work those contributions and those gifts in the best way that you see appropriate at that time to support the mission of your organization. Another type of gift that you might accept is something that would be easily converted to cash, such as a stock gift. Just remember, when you are accepting stock, you also want to be sure your policy is very clear that you best practice would be you do not hold the stock, you're not trying to time the market, but that in fact you would accept the stock, you will sell that. And so you would want to be sure that your procedures are there in place to do that and that you have a stockbroker that you can use to make that happen. Other gifts, though, that might come your way are things like real property, houses, cars, boats. And in the dialogue that you would be having as you build this really effective gift acceptance policy is internally you're talking about what does it take to again get something like that into a liquid cash mode if you accept real property. You know, what are the transaction costs going to be? So you want to think about that. If you take houses, what's the value of the houses or the cars, etc. Insurance policies, that's another one sometimes that you will accept. You want to have the dialogue again internally to decide who's going to pay premiums, if the donor is, or if you will, to get the death benefits. Also, donor advised funds are greatly used these days. And of course, a lot of donors will want to give through those. So you'd want to talk about internally, what does that look like to accept those? Matching gifts. So those are all just some of the examples of gifts that you may accept. But again, it will be very unique to your organization as you talk through that to determine what those are and how to set that up in your gift acceptance policy. The other thing that would be in the gift acceptance policy would be the payment method. So are you going to accept Venmo, PayPal? Again, you can understand how between a finance and a development office, that would be really important to determine and to operationalize if you're going to accept gifts through that method. Credit cards, which type, for example, checks and cash, stock, as I mentioned, wire transfers, ACHs, those may be other methods that are used to make these gifts. The third area that you would want to address as well is planned gifts. So, for example, bequest. Sometimes you'll receive a revocable bequest or an irrevocable bequest, and how you actually set that up and document that would be very important to communicate within the organization and then have it stated in your gift acceptance policy. Sometimes organizations will accept charitable gift annuities, charitable remainder trusts, charitable lead trust. So you'd want to just be aware, again, is your organization ready to accept something like those instruments, which are planned gifts. The best planned gift really that you can get is going to be undesignated. So again, if somebody says, I've left something for you in my will, and it comes to you and it says, this is for you as the organization, use it as you wish, that really provides the most flexibility for your organization. There may be times, though, when the gift arrives and it has stipulations or conditions on it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But you will want to have, again, in the policy, what to do if it comes with certain designations. We would want to talk about IRA distributions and under planned gifts as well. And the fourth area I would talk about that would be a key component to be very clear about in your gift acceptance policy would be pledges. And when you're in a large campaign or you're accepting larger gifts that will be paid over time, it's really important to know how you're going to work with the finance office again, if you're in the development office, to understand what the pledge is. So I like to remind everybody to be very clear, have a very clear letter of intent or an MOU that talks about what the purpose of the gift is, the amount of the gift, the schedule for payments of the gift, and then also to put in cypre language. And for those of you who may or may not be familiar with that, it basically says that if in the future something transpires that changes the purpose or the need for that gift, that the institution, the board of trustees, can try to apply that gift to something as close or as near as possible. And that's really to protect the institution, because there have been instances where the purpose for a gift that a donor gave maybe 10, 20, 50 years ago has changed. And then you're just holding this gift and the money, perhaps it's in an endowment that you can't use. Otherwise, you would have to go back and try and find family members and talk to them. But if you have this language in there, it can really help you as an institution then do the right thing at that moment to apply the gift to something that is very similar to the purpose that it was given for. And again, please be sure you have those LOIs or MOUs signed by both the institution and by the donor. Brian, I don't know if you want to interject anything here right now. I know we've talked a little bit about pledges and kind of what's binding and accounting treatments.
Sure. But before I get to that, Patty, I'd like to kind of go back to the payment methods that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And again, here's where the communications between accounting or finance and development are important. Some of the newer methods in terms of like the PayPal and the Venmo, sometimes they can be business accounts and sometimes they have to be personal accounts. And so, most organizations are going to have its own internal controls dealing with who has the authority to make transactions and accept transactions when it comes to cash accounts and things like that. So, it's very common nowadays, especially with younger donors. They want to do everything online. They want to do everything off their phone and things like that. And I'm not trying to discourage that, but you have to think through that in terms of, does that fit within the organizational structure, or maybe the organizational structure has to be changed and so forth. So really consider that when in terms of accepting some of the newer type of gift, the gift processes. The other thing is there are several giving platforms out there that are not other nonprofit organizations that are out there, and they do it at a very low cost in terms of the collection. So like, I've seen PayPal's fees have gone up, and I see more and more people going to Sprite or other type situations. And that's not a endorsement of Sprite or anything else like that, but there's financial implications of those type of situations. So really consider that. I guess the other, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm, that's fine, go on.
All right. The other thing is to consider in the gift acceptance policy would be, the cost of fundraising. Now, I know that can change from campaign to campaign, but I think that's probably an important factor to consider in there. Who's paying for this? And that should be part of the gift acceptance policy, or at least a question as to if we're going to do something, a decision has been made as to the source of the fundraising.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing, go ahead. I'm sorry, Patty.
I was going to also add the other thing within the gift acceptance policy may deal a couple other items, anonymity, in the sense that sometimes you will have donors who want to be anonymous. And so you should have some statement in there, because we also talked about this policy is actually something that can be shared with donors. And internally, you need to know how your development office will deal with anonymity. And then on the finance side, as Brian and I have often talked about, there are sometimes some reporting rules where you have to, on the 990s, put the donors, but it's not put out publicly. The other thing is naming rights. Your naming rights, again, should really be thought about in terms of the, the value. How much does somebody need to give to your organization to actually have that right to say, name an endowed fund or a scholarship or something like that. Also, your gift acceptance policy should say that the institution gets to approve the final name, and you can think about that, because obviously, again, with reputation, conflict of interest, et cetera, you want to be sure that it's a name that's appropriate, that you want to have within your annual reports and on your website, et cetera. When do you actually get the naming rights is another component that you would want to think through. For example, if somebody has agreed to endow a program or maybe a building, they're going to contribute to that. If they've provided a pledge to start that gift in motion, how much of that pledge should actually be completed and paid off before the naming rights are actually set up? So those are really important things to think about and to have in this gift acceptance policy. And as Brian just said, and we're going to talk a little bit later about during campaigns, you may come back to amend and to add to your standing gift acceptance policy for any of these key components that may change under a campaign that you're in the middle of. So, Brian, I think you had something else to add. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's fine. I guess my other comment is, the internet's great, and I'm sure if you Google, or I guess I shouldn't say Google, search for gift acceptance policy, there's a ton of templates out there. But my comment, my warning would be, just don't take and download something, slap your name on it without really putting the thought and effort into it to see what works for your organization itself. As Patti has said on, numerous examples where she's talked about where you may not want to take a gift, or you may want to take a gift. That's fine. That type should be in there, but just don't take, these templates out there without putting the proper thought into it. The other thing in terms of the naming rights and so forth, you really need to think about it from a long-term basis, not just, currently. As Patti mentioned, I think you would probably have a limit in your naming rights from that type of situation. But if this policy is going to go on for 30, 40, 50, 100 years, that $50,000 gift, which seems really incredible right now, is that going to be able to sustain itself in terms of, the purpose of that gift over a period of time? There's no crystal ball on that. There's no right or wrong answer per se, but just kind of, factor that into your thoughts, that it's just not for now, not for the next 5 or 10 years. It could be for a long period of time as well.
Now, I'd like to underscore that too. Really good practice would be to review it periodically, every 2 to 3 years, let's say, internally. And if, the things have changed and you need to reflect that, then you would want to amend it, put it forward to the board again for their approval. So I thank you. That's a very good point.
Yeah, and going back to Patti's comment about cypre language, I mean, from an audit standpoint, we've seen where gifts are made and with all good intention, but for whatever reason, the focus of the organization has changed, or the program has changed, and this organization may have a lot of money sitting there that it just can't use, from that standpoint. So again, as part of the strategic process, and just again, look at it from a long-term basis, not just a short-term basis. We did have a comment in the Q&A that for anonymous donors, the pledge letter should include, whom the organization will be aware of the gift, whether it's the CEO, the development officers, or finance. I can tell you from an audit standpoint, that's, I'm pretty sure it's development, and we'll go into a little bit more in terms of accounting about, what information is available. But I can tell you how many reports I see, it says anonymous, but then out in the notes section, it says Mary Jane or John Doe or something like that. So again, with the organization, you want to respect the rights of the donor to say, I want this gift to be anonymous. But as Patti, mentioned earlier, there are some IRS requirements that you do, you may have to disclose some of those donors depending on the size of the gift and the organizational structure.
Thank you for the question and comment, because it is true. Sometimes there's a very high level of anonymity related around particular donors. And other times it is just more to the outside world. So yes, thank you. You would definitely want to, and that could be a one-off, right? You know, just under your policy, you might say that the basic way we treat anonymity is blah, blah, blah. But we will consider, you know, special situations, and then you could put that in your LOI or your MOU. Okay.
I think that would, I think most organizations, you know, print out a list of donors. And so I think that's a good point for that.
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of at the end of that section. Are there any questions that people may have about a gift acceptance policy? You know, again, I think it's regardless of the size of the organization, it should have that. And again, it's a tool to be used to prepare for situations, not deal with the situation after it happens. Okay, because you know, I again, just from a practical standpoint, I see organizations have accepted gifts because you know many, you know, not just now, but it seems like forever. You know, charitable organizations are always looking for funding. There's always so much to do, so much good to do, and there's always the question as to how you're going to pay for that, how you're going to fund that type situation. And sometimes what looks like a good deal just isn't a good deal. You know, from that standpoint, I'll hit in a few minutes about some of the challenges when it comes to non-cash contributions. But again, you know, it's just it's a planning tool. So we do have a question about Bitcoin, about whether using Bitcoin or cyber currencies. Patty, do you want to touch that, or?
I mean, I'll just answer that. I think that's a great example of what needs to be discussed internally, and the more you can have those discussions up front and put in your gift acceptance policy, if in fact you are going to accept cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, etc., then you know that ahead of time. If you don't have that in your policy and something like this was presented, then you would do invoke the committee, which I was discussing earlier. So it's really, in my mind, kind of up to the organization, and to be very clear about whether you do or do not accept it. And if it's in the policy, then it's very easy to point to, and it is, you know, very easy to be sure your development officers are aware of that when they're soliciting and managing gifts.
I would say, and this is increasingly, you know, cyber currency is increasing with for-profits, with nonprofits, and things like that. You know, you may look at that like a stock and bond. I mean, do you want to be an investor in a cybersecurity like Bitcoin, or do you want to liquidate it right away? In either case, you know, you want to have I'll say your ducks in a row beforehand. If you're going to have a wallet to accept funds, then you have to have it, and you know that should be set up beforehand and considered. You know, put your internal controls around it from a finance standpoint, and then be able to, you know, whether you decide to liquidate it or keep it. I guess that's again part of your strategic plan. John, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you all said to that. I think the issue becomes, you know, how do you, from a financial standpoint, the recognition and valuation of these things becomes very challenging, right? The understanding of any restrictions and the volatility of this gift itself becomes another risk management issue that you as an organization will need to think about. In certain instances, there are tax implications, so you know you need to understand what that all involves. And then just finally, how will you put in place appropriate protocols and internal controls to assess this new gift and ensure that you're handling it appropriately and being able to comply with the reporting requirements that are required for it, not just from a donor and fundraising perspective, but also from a financial perspective, reporting out to your constituents. So it brings a host of new opportunities, but a host of new challenges, as all good things do. But organizations need to think long and hard about whether they want to accept these types of gifts.
Yeah. Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next slide?
I think we've answered all the questions, so please.
Okay. We wanted to touch today too upon understanding the different types of campaigns. And I'm sure most all of us on the webinar today have an understanding of them, but we wanted to just touch upon them, think about the pros and cons, and maybe again how the language and the operationalization around them can cause maybe some miscommunications between the finance and the development offices and how we might improve that. So let's just discuss each here briefly. With annual giving, as you know, that is really vital to your operating budget. It's budget relieving. Unrestricted gifts you're usually looking for in that campaign. Really, it's the lifeblood of most organizations. Pledges, if they're made for the annual campaign, just remember that they need to be paid off during the time of that campaign, which is the fiscal year. And sometimes business offices will decide not to actually even track those pledges, which is fine because they know they have to convert to cash by the end of the year. So sometimes that can be a little discrepancy in internal reporting. The development office may be saying, hey, we have X amount in gifts and pledges, but the finance report is showing something less. And that could be because they are just reporting out on cash. But by the end of the fiscal year, it all should come together because, of course, the job of the development office will be to collect any pledges that have been made during the year for that year. For capital campaigns, obviously, they're for very specific purposes, usually for a capital project. For those, you should have a campaign plan that has been written to talk about the purpose of that campaign, what you're raising money for, how much is being raised. And we've alluded to this earlier, but I would like to touch upon it here. If your campaign is not self-funded, meaning through your operating budget, and you are going to have to raise funds to cover not only the capital, for example, but maybe fundraising consultants, extra marketing materials, maybe a new website, or if there's even ongoing maintenance that you may want to raise money for to support, let's say, a building that's being built through this capital campaign, you want to be sure that you are putting that in the marketing materials that you are sharing with donors. And I like to even put it on the LOI or in the MOU so that it is very clear that the money they're contributing to is helping to cover those types of costs. You might also at this point go back to your gift acceptance policy, because remember that should be standard, evergreen, it's there. But when you get into a capital campaign or even an endowment campaign, maybe you're going to change the value or the amount to get a naming right, for example. You might want to also talk if it has to do with construction of a building. You might want to be very clear about at what point you may move forward if you haven't raised all the money. Those are really, really important internal discussions to have because sometimes finance can get, and the institution can get very excited to move forward if they see maybe 75% of the money raised or 80% of the money raised. But in fact, that can often be make it harder if the institution moves forward on that for development to raise that last 25 or 20% of the total that's trying to be raised, just because donors really like to be inspired to create something and often aren't as motivated to say donate to relieve debt if the institution took debt on for that extra 25 or 20%. So again, you may come back to that gift acceptance policy. So again, thinking up front, when you're setting that campaign in motion, what do you need to do special for setting that up for the institution to be successful and to have good communications between the two offices? For endowment campaigns, of course, those are wonderful to have. All institutions would like to have this savings account, if you will, money that's contributed for investment in perpetuity.
Like Patty's froze there for a second. We'll give her a second to recover there. But while we're waiting on Patti, I did want to give some resources to the group when it comes to different type of campaigns and financing and a code of ethics in conducting a campaign. You're back on. Go, Patti. You froze for a second.
Oh, sorry. The other thing that I was going to say is that the comprehensive campaign in which you're combining annual with either capital or annual with capital and endowment is really important to always consider. I know you all probably know this, but campaigns are really just a marketing push, right? And so you're getting materials pulled together, you're getting your community very excited. But in that excitement, people may decide they want to give to capital and endowment, and they take what they would normally give from annual and put it into those buckets. So always through doing these types of campaigns, think about how you can work in an annual gift as well, so you don't lose that really, really important unrestricted giving that's going into your operating budgets during that time. And of course, if you're not in a campaign, you're planning for one. So as you're approaching the campaigns, think about donor fatigue. Think about, again, how are you going to fund these campaigns? Because campaigns can be very expensive. Is it going to come from operating or from the money that you actually raise within the campaign? I'm going to pause right there just to see if we have any questions, or Brian, if you wanted to add anything.
I have a few comments. There's no questions at this point in time. I'd start saying this when you froze, but again, from a resource standpoint, when you're putting together your campaign, when you're just dealing with fundraising, for not-for-profits, there's called the Association of Fundraising Professionals. That includes a code of ethics that as to how to conduct these campaigns, what information should be in there or not. And for schools, they have the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. One's CASE, one's AFP. Both are tremendous resource areas for the organization. I guess just in terms of the different type of campaigns and so forth, as Patti said, you got to be careful about donor fatigue. And I know in real estate they say timing is everything, but I think timing is everything too, and fundraising as well. I think you'll see on most capital campaigns, most major gifts will come when the stock market is up, because usually a donor would want to give a large stock amount because they get a deduction for the fair value, and so they're most likely to pay off a gift based on that type of situation because it's advantageous for them, it's advantageous for the organization. So that should be part of your planning, as well. And then I guess the last thing is, especially on a capital campaign and maybe even on the endowment, accounting and development should make sure they're on the same page. So like, for example, if you're building a building, what cost components go into that building? Is it just the cost of the building, but there's plenty of cost beforehand? There's feasibility studies, there's architectural studies and so forth. There's interest, and there could be interest and carrying cost of loans during the cost of that. And I think that's where accounting and development really need to get together, because you may go to a construction person, they say, oh, it's going to cost you $30 million for this building, but the true cost may be 35 million or a higher number once you count in these other soft costs and these other carrying type of costs. So again, just communications up front, work together through this process is the big thing, because I think too often what I've seen from an outside standpoint looking in is the accountant likes to do, okay, my job is to record things in the journal ledger and put it on a financial statement, and development is my job is to raise money, okay? And that's true to a certain extent, but especially so that there's no egg on anyone's face, that you achieve that success, having these communications early, often, and throughout the process, I think just raises again the chance of success. Okay. All right. Any questions on that? Oh, this is a good crowd here, Patti. They have no questions from a standpoint, so we know everything. Now, so let's advance the slide. The next comment is on contributions, and I'm going to try to hit in three main areas, which is restricted versus unrestricted, conditional versus unconditional, and cash versus non-cash. And this is really one of the more complex, it can be one of the more complex areas of accounting. And certainly we could spend more than an hour just talking about different type of contributions. But it's important for both the development and accounting to understand gift accounting from both from both perspectives, as they can be, as development accounting can end up two different results, from that standpoint. We have intentions to give and promises to give, but on a very simple level, a gift is an unconditional transfer between two or more parties where the giving party expects nothing of equal value in return. So basically, I'm giving Patty's nonprofit $100 million to do as she sees, please. Okay. It's not always that simple, but it's considered a non-reciprocal transfer. That transfer can be cash investments, or it can be non-cash items as well. As Patty alluded to earlier, the non-cash items can be very difficult in terms of some challenges in terms of valuation and so forth. It could be the free use of facilities, free services, or even the cancellation of liabilities and debt. Okay. Contributions are not, though, and we got to be very careful with this, is they're not agency transactions. That's where someone says, I'm going to give you $100,000 and you're going to give it to, I'm going to give Patty $100,000, her nonprofit, but she's got to give that $100,000 to John. That's really just a pass-through, transaction. And if there's no variance power, that is the right for Patty to decide what to do with that money, then that's not really considered a contribution. There are exchange transactions. That's where you're getting value back for what you're giving. Again, there's rules on this one, and if anyone who's watched PBS, and if you donate $100, you're going to get this little lion or a little stuffed animal or something like that. That could be part of that's a contribution, part of that's an exchange transaction, and we have to clarify intentions versus unconditional promises to give. So again, I think, as Patty said earlier, unrestricted gifts are the best because the organization and its best, can use its best practices to decide how best to it can benefit the organization. But that's hard. It's really hard sometimes to get so many unrestricted, contributions. Usually you have people giving to the annual fund, and that's usually unrestricted. It's easy sometimes to do. Someone may have a particular interest, like they like a building, they may have a program. Your child may be, if it's a school, your child may be a future soccer star, so they want to do something to improve the soccer program at your school. That could be a restriction. It could be for any number of things at organizations. It could be, climate is a big issue. Maybe you want to do, you want your money to do specifically with some type of benefits to the climate, to the climate industry. So those are the type of gifts that comes, and they usually comes with strings attached by the donor that may restrict the use of the funds, like I said, for a specific program or purpose, or maybe based on the timing of that. Again, we've talked about examples being construction of buildings and so forth. But there's important factors here. So even though you may get a gift that's restricted for development purposes, there are important factors considered from an accounting standpoint. As Pat said, is it within the gift acceptance policy? If you have that, if you want to fund this program, you want to raise the level of the soccer program at a school, for example, that may be great for 3 or 4 years when that person's son or daughter is in that program. But what happens after that, that 3 or 4 year period of time and so forth. So that's where it goes back into the strategic plans of the organization. If there is a restricted gift, then there's got to be a communication mechanism between development and accounting as to how that restriction is being met. Okay. In the case of, building, is probably pretty easy. It's when the building is built, those restrictions are released. If it's a program such as I mentioned for soccer or for like for climate, is how that money being spent? Is it being spent to raise awareness? If it's like a climate type situation, is it to inform the public about a specific issue? And there's got to be that communication message so accounting knows how to record that transaction. And going back to what Patty said about a unified system, if in her system it's fund number 100, then maybe it should be a sub-account 100 in the accounting system, just to try to facilitate that information and so that both accounting and development knows what's going on with that.
And also, just to add, if I could, Brian, on that, clearly from a donor perspective, especially if it's a restricted gift, you want to be able to steward that donor and report out how the gift was used, right? So really knowing that the finance office is in communications with you on how they're releasing that restricted money and how it is getting spent. Again, it might be something that's being spent over a year. It might be something that's happening over 3 years. But really having the finance office understand why having an easy, quick reporting on that is important to the development side, I think is key in this communications too, because as we all know, keeping a donor happy is probably one of the easiest paths to getting more contributions than finding a new donor, right? So having that understanding of why, when the development officer needs that information from the finance office, why it's important, I think is key to that effective and communications and optimizing how the two groups are working together.
Okay. So we have restricted gifts. Again, as Patty mentioned before, have that side priority language in there so that if the need to change the restriction on it in the future, it's built into that. I'll just briefly, we had one organization that one year they decided to have a big, fundraising campaign to do scholarships. It was very successful, but then the organization had some hard times and they didn't have the resources to manage the fund, the scholarship program, and it caused a lot of, problems with that organization, not just from a financial standpoint, but from a leadership standpoint.
Okay.
The next section is conditional versus unconditional. We'll come back to that. There's one question. We'll come back to that one. The next level. No, I'm sorry. Can we go back a slide? Would be the conditional versus the unconditional gift. Obviously an unconditional, unrestricted gift is like money in the bank, so to speak. But sometimes donors want to have conditions on there. And a condition is basically what the name implies. It's that there's one or more barriers that must be overcome before the organization is entitled to the assets, and there's a right of return. So again, development and accounting should consider this as part of their gifts acceptance policy and make sure that that everyone's on board as to accepting a conditional gift. Sometimes a conditional gift can be something as simple as I'll name you the beneficiary of a trust or a will, and that's great for development. They'll record that, hey, Mary, Jane, or John Doe said they're going to give us $100,000 upon their death. But for accounting, that would not be recorded as a gift because it's conditioned. The donor can change the will and until they pass.
Okay.
Or another one will be, I will give you X amount of dollars as long as Y still exists. Okay. I'll give you $10,000 a year as long as I'm still on the board of directors. Okay. And that could be something like that. And then certain grants and awards. So you have to be careful about the conditional gifts. Again, recognize that accounting and development may have it differently. Accounting still needs to know that because in their financial statements, conditional gifts have to be disclosed. They're not recorded as income until the condition is relieved. But it has to be disclosed in the financial statements in one of a couple ways. So as Patty mentioned earlier, a carefully crafted LOI or MOU and documentation of donor communications can be very useful in resolving questions about a gift. I want to.
Just with the check on time, do we want to go on to internal reporting?
Yeah, I was just going to take just 2 minutes on non-cash gifts.
Okay.
The challenges with non-cash gifts are, again, as I think mentioned before, to value it. If someone gives you a piece of, if they give a piece of property or something of that nature, how do you value it? Or if it's free services and so forth. So that can charge a lot of challenges for on the accounting side to make sure that it's being done properly. One thing that a lot of nonprofits fall into is that a donor will say, this gift is worth $20,000. There's forms involved. And my comment there is that a nonprofit should never sign off or approve what the value of the gift is, because the value of the gift to the donor versus the organization can change. Again, going over real briefly, the premium of life insurance. And then the other thing is looking forward is the maintenance and preservation of that non-cash item. I'm aware of one situation where a very expensive piece of artwork was given to a nonprofit organization, and the security and the maintenance around that and preservation of that piece of artwork was very costly to the organization. So I think I'll stop at that point in time, and let's go on to, because we're short on time here. So let's go to the next slide. And again, one question though, Patty, before we start. The language was Cypress, it's CYPRES. Okay, and at the end of the session, this session will be able to be downloaded. And so some of the comments such as that will be is included on that one for the person asking the question. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Pat. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. So we wanted to just touch upon, again, internal reporting and accounting. We know, again, that Greek and that Latin can happen, right? One gift, and we see the gift in two different ways. So one of the things that we want to stress today is, especially in a campaign, something that's unique, that's about to be kicked off, really work together to have, as Brian mentioned, and I would support maybe a similar numbering system so that your database tracks a gift going into a particular fund the same way that the accounting office is doing that. And again, when either a campaign and special subsets under that campaign are being set up, working together to set up what that numbering will be. Often you could have, I know some examples to share with you would be maybe funds that start with 1 or 4 undesignated bequests, maybe 2 are restricted giving gifts or spend down accounts. 3 might be endowed funds, 4 might be your annual fund or your annual giving campaign. And being sure that the gifts that you're receiving, especially under a big campaign for capital or endowment, aren't going into one bin in the accounting office, because then the funds seemingly are commingled. It's very hard to have clear reporting then to the board and to internal stakeholders about where you are in terms of fundraising and money that's been collected. So I can't stress enough that time spent together between the finance and the development office is so valuable. Because then you just immediately move into operations, right? And starting to raise that money. When the money comes in through the development office, you've got the fund that translates to the fund on the finance side. Obviously, as you get MOUs and LOIs, I always like to recommend those get passed along as well to the finance office. And then again, both of the offices have the same definition around a fund that's being set up. Pledges, we've mentioned that this obviously becomes a very important part of any campaign and raising large dollars for these campaigns. So being in touch with each other about follow-up communications with the donors, evaluating the collectability, setting up reserves. Brian, maybe you again would like to just touch upon that and how a finance office would think through when it's time to write off a pledge, how that's communicated back to the development office, and also some of the reserve issues around pledges.
So again, I mean, most pledges, there's some subtle differences between the amount of the gift that development would have and the actual pledge amount. If someone promises to give $10,000 a year for 5 years, development may have that as $50,000, but under accounting, you have to discount that for the time value of money, and you may have to discount that for a collectability thing. But the important thing here in terms of communication is not to wait and do it once a year. Okay, I've seen where accounting offices says, well, that's development's problem, let them deal with it, and I'll look at the end of the year. But then if something happens at the end of the year and there's a larger write-off than expected, then that affects the accounting side as well. So regular meeting between the two, making sure we know who does what and when, what your collection policy is. In some ways, it's just like the collection policy for a for-profit business. I mean, you have to probably have a little bit lighter touch, but there's got to be the constant communications with the donor. And again, I'll go back to development, keeping good notes on on donor communications will tell you, okay, well, I know I promised you pay the $10,000, but something happened. It's going to be 3 months late. I think that shows, just more and more information is helpful for the organization. And then again, if most of the organizations are having an audit, the collectability has to be looked at. And that could be based on any number of issues. It could be based on prior campaigns. It could be based on the different phases of your campaign, so forth. But again, it all comes down to having the two people, not say two, but the two departments talking together and working together from that standpoint.
Great.
Okay, yeah, there's a question up. Will the recording of the session be available to share with relevant members of our organization? Yes. So there'll be a link at the end of the slide that you'll be able to I can't remember how long it'll do, but in a couple of days you'll be able to go to that link and be able to download it from our website. Okay.
And then Brian, there was another one in there directed to you.
Okay. Any comments on cash versus P&L recognition and understanding the difference? Cash is king. Yeah, cash is, that's a, I'm going to say, part of me as an accountant says accrual is the best way to go about it. And so I want to clarify when we say cash versus P&L recognition. Can you be more specific on that one? Because you're going to, most organizations are going to be on an accrual method and they're going to recognize a pledge at the beginning. I think, that's probably the preferred practice, and the cash as you go from that standpoint. I'm sorry, does that answer your question? You said yes, cash flow versus P&L recognition.
I will say that, from a reporting standpoint, obviously these are two different things. If you're in a capital campaign, though, this is really critical, right? Because, generally speaking, if you're looking to your development office to raise the funds for that particular capital campaign, you will want to monitor cash to know where you are, and cash is king. I would agree 100% on that, because then the organization again is going to have to make a decision. Do you wait to collect on? You might have pledges that get you to your total amount you're trying to raise, but if the pledges are not materializing in cash soon enough, then the organization will have to make a decision on that. And I highly recommend you think a lot of that through when you set that campaign plan in motion. Okay. Looks like we are
okay, I'm sorry.
getting close to the end now.
Yeah. So I guess just let me take 1 minute on engaging fundraising with third-party consultants. A lot of organizations, small organizations will do that. Like any contract, you should do your due diligence from that standpoint. Make sure you understand what the deliverables are, set your milestones, because unfortunately, I'll go back, Patty said about marketing. This is marketing, this is selling type situation, and people will promise the world. And so the organization should just have, like I said, milestones, reasons in there in order to control that process, because it does have implications. If you're using a third-party campaign to raise funds, all this is disclosed on your 990. And so the information about what you've done is out there. So I'm sorry, you can move the slide, please. Okay, so again, in the interest of time, I want to leave it open for any last questions, from that standpoint. We have one person would like to answer the last question live. Can we turn on the for Robert Torito? Is that possible, Ryan?
Yes, just give me one quick second. Hold on.
I think we need to. Or if Robert, if you want to take this offline, we'll be glad to do that. I'm not trying to.
He should be able to talk now.
Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I didn't have a specific question. I was just commenting on the cash and both departments having a full understanding that, yes, a pledge can come in if you're on an accrual basis and you can book it to your P&L, but when the cash is coming in to a not-for-profit is also so important.
Right.
So that it's a balance between understanding what I can accrue and when that cash is coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, absolutely.
So it was just a comment, that's all.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, John, you want to finish up for us?
That sounds great. So on to the next slide. We've arrived at our allotted time, unfortunately. It's been a great topic for discussions. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for this insightful webinar on optimizing communications between the development team and finance. I want to thank Brian and Patty for all their information and helping us walk through some of the considerations. Throughout the webinar, we explored some challenges, looked at some issues that arise between finance and development. And I think as we conclude, it really just hones in on the communication and collaboration that's needed between the two departments, right? It all comes down to breaking down silos and fostering a organization that speaks to each other, understands how it impacts the organization, not just from a cash position or a P&L position, but from an overall growth position within the organization. So again, on behalf of Citrin Cooperman, on behalf of our panelists and myself and our not-for-profit team, I really want to express my sincere thanks to everybody for participating, especially with the questions that have come in. Remember that this is a journey. You do need to continue to speak and communicate and adapt continuously throughout your lifetime in the organization here. And we as an organization are here to help you and sustain you as you go forward. So again, if there's any questions, please do feel free to reach out to any of us. Our information has been included within this playback, and we'd be happy to respond and talk to you further about these items. Again, we appreciate all your time. If you have any further questions, please reach out. But thank you again for joining us on this webinar, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Be well, and thank you.